It all started on a cold, rainy night in a small, upscale restaurant where Elizabeth, a young and hopeful woman, sat across from her friends. The sound of the rain against the windows was the only thing breaking the silence as they enjoyed their meals. It was supposed to be a casual dinner, a celebration of her recent engagement, but as soon as Elizabeth mentioned the name of her fiancé, the atmosphere in the room shifted. "Wait, he's the billionaire?" one of her friends, Natalie, asked, raising an eyebrow. Elizabeth nodded, her heart pounding in her chest as she smiled softly. Her fiancé, Alexander Thorne, was the talk of the town, a mysterious, powerful man who seemed to come from nowhere, amassing an empire that spanned across industries. But what made their relationship stand out to her was that their love wasn't based on his wealth. Elizabeth had always been a firm believer in love over money. She wasn't interested in the spotlight that came with Alexander's fortune. All she wanted was him, his smile, his laugh, his caring nature. He had swept her off her feet in the most unexpected ways, at a time when she least expected it. But the reaction she was getting now from her friends made her second-guess herself. "Elizabeth, don't get me wrong, but you're telling us you're marrying a man with billions, and it's all for love?" Another friend, Julie, asked skeptically. The room fell silent. Elizabeth's fingers curled around the stem of her wine glass, trying to hide the unease that threatened to show on her face. She had gotten used to these questions. Over the course of their brief yet intense courtship, Alexander had been the subject of endless rumors and gossip. People whispered about his secretive nature, about his past that seemed to be buried under layers of wealth and mystery. No one knew where he had come from, what he'd been through before he built his empire. But what truly struck Elizabeth the most was the way people treated her. They spoke as though her feelings didn't matter, as though the only reason she could possibly be with him was because of his money. "No one believes me," Elizabeth murmured quietly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. She looked down at her plate, pushing around the food she had no appetite for. "Elizabeth, I'm just saying, don't you find it strange?" Natalie pressed. "All these rumors about him being cold, controlling, and, well, just not the kind of person a normal girl like you would go for." Elizabeth flinched at the word normal. It stung more than she cared to admit. She wasn't naive. She understood the way of his fortune, but she had fallen for Alexander Mann, not Alexander the billionaire. She took a deep breath, her resolve firm. "I know what you're all thinking, but this isn't about his money. I swear, it's love. Real love." Her friends exchanged glances, their skepticism only growing. Elizabeth could feel the walls closing in around her. No matter how hard she tried, no one would believe her. Everyone thought she was with him for the wrong reasons. It was as if her words carried no weight, and her love for him was overshadowed by his wealth. It was suffocating. But what they didn't know was that Alexander had never cared about her status or her background. He had never wanted her to change, to become someone she wasn't. And despite the rumors surrounding his fortune, he had shown her a side of himself no one else had ever seen. The phone on the table buzzed, interrupting the conversation. Elizabeth glanced at the screen. It was a message from Alexander. "I can't wait to see you tonight. You've made my life complete." Her heart skipped a beat as she read the words. She smiled, the warmth of his message chasing away the cold thoughts creeping into her mind. She quickly typed a reply. "I love you, Alexander, always and forever." But as she hit send, she felt a sense of unease wash over her. Was she being naive? Could she really trust in their love, knowing how many people doubted her? She shook her head, brushing the thoughts aside. Tonight was supposed to be about celebrating their future together, not about other people's doubts. She had to believe in them, in their connection. The conversation around the table continued, but Elizabeth's mind was elsewhere. The world around her seemed to blur as she thought about Alexander and what their life together would look like. She wasn't going to let anyone or anything distract her from what felt real and true. But deep down, she knew that the journey she was about to embark on wasn't going to be as simple as she had hoped. There was more to Alexander than she understood, more than she was prepared for. And the questions everyone was asking, were they more than just doubts? Could there be something hidden behind those eyes? Something she hadn't yet discovered? Her thoughts were interrupted as her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from Alexander. "Hi," she answered, her voice soft. "I'm outside," he said, his voice low and comforting. "Ready for our night?" Elizabeth's heart fluttered. She stood, excusing herself from the table. She didn't care about the whispers anymore. She was going to see him, and she was going to show everyone just how real their love was. Little did she know, this was only the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything she believed about love, and everything she believed about Alexander. The night air was crisp as Elizabeth stepped outside the restaurant, her breath visible in the cold. She saw Alexander's sleek black car parked at the curb, its engine idling softly. The headlights illuminated his figure, tall and imposing, standing beside the vehicle. There was something about the way he stood, so confident and composed, that always made her heart race. He was everything she had ever wanted and more. As she approached him, he smiled warmly, his eyes lighting up with affection. "You look stunning," he said, his voice rich with sincerity. Elizabeth felt a rush of happiness, but as they embraced, a lingering thought tugged at the back of her mind, one that wouldn't go away no matter how hard she tried to push it aside. Was this real? Alexander opened the door for her, and she slipped into the car. As they drove the quiet streets, the familiar cityscape blurred past them. The soft hum of the engine and the sound of rain pattering against the windows created a strange sense of calm, but inside, Elizabeth couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her chest. She glanced over at Alexander, who was focused on the road ahead, his jaw tense. She reached out, placing her hand gently on his. He glanced at her for a moment before returning his gaze to the road, but the subtle shift in his demeanor didn't go unnoticed. "Is everything okay?" Elizabeth asked, her voice tentative. Alexander's lips parted for a moment as if he were about to speak, but he paused, his brow furrowing. "Everything's fine," he said finally, but the words sounded almost too rehearsed. Elizabeth frowned, sensing there was more to the story. They had always shared a connection, an unspoken understanding that allowed them to communicate without words. She could tell when something was bothering him, just as he could tell when something was off with her. But tonight, there was a wall between them, and she didn't know why. The car slowed as they approached a grand estate on the outskirts of the city. Elizabeth had visited Alexander's mansion several times before, but tonight, the imposing gates and towering structure seemed different, somehow. The estate loomed like a fortress, casting long shadows in the moonlight. The sight sent a shiver down her spine, and she couldn't help but feel as though something wasn't quite right. As they entered the mansion, Alexander's demeanor changed. He became even more distant, more guarded, as if something were weighing heavily on his mind. They walked to the grand hall, the marble floors gleaming under the soft glow of the chandeliers. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the echo of their footsteps. Elizabeth followed him to the mansion, her eyes flicking nervously to the paintings that adorned the walls. Portraits of men and women in elaborate frames, their eyes following her every move. She couldn't help but feel like they were being watched. Her instincts told her that this wasn't just a beautiful home. It was a place filled with secrets, and Alexander was hiding something from her. "I'll be right back," Alexander said abruptly, breaking her out of her thoughts. "Make yourself comfortable. I'll bring us some drinks." Elizabeth nodded, though the unease in her chest only deepened. She watched him disappear down a hallway, the sound of his footsteps gradually fading as he walked further into the mansion. Alone now, she looked around, her gaze drawn to a large mirror at the far end of the hallway. She couldn't help but approach it, feeling an odd pull. As she stood in front of the mirror, her reflection stared back at her, soft and calm, but her eyes were wide with uncertainty. Something about the mansion felt off. She wasn't sure what it was, but it was like an invisible presence was lurking just beyond the edges of her perception. Her heart began to race as she turned away from the mirror, deciding to explore the hallway. She moved cautiously, her footsteps barely making a sound as she walked deeper into the house. The silence was unnerving, almost suffocating. As she passed a closed door, she noticed a faint light coming from underneath. She paused for a moment, debating whether to investigate. Against her better judgment, she reached for the doorknob and gently turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a small study. The room was dimly lit by a desk lamp, casting long shadows across the walls. But it wasn't the room that caught her attention. It was the man sitting at the desk, Alexander's father. Elizabeth froze, her heart skipping a beat. She had never met Alexander's father before, but she knew exactly who he was. He was a shadowy figure in Alexander's life, someone he rarely spoke of, and whenever Elizabeth inquired about him, the conversation was quickly shut down. Alexander's father looked up from his papers, his cold eyes locking onto hers. A thin smile curled on his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. There was something unsettling about him, a chill that radiated from his presence. "I see you found the study," he said, his voice smooth and calculating. "You must be Elizabeth." Elizabeth's throat tightened. I didn't mean to intrude," she stammered, her nerves getting the best of her. He stood, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator sizing up its prey. "It's no intrusion. Come in. I've been expecting you." Elizabeth hesitated, but curiosity drove her forward. She stepped into the room, her eyes never leaving the man who seemed to exude an aura of power and control. Something told her that Alexander's father was a man who wasn't used to people saying no, a man who had seen and done things Elizabeth could never imagine. Before she could speak, he gestured to a chair opposite him. "Please sit. We have much to discuss." A chill ran down her spine, but she obeyed. As she sat down, she wondered if this was the first of many uncomfortable conversations she'd be having. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something darker at play, something much bigger than the love she believed she shared with Alexander. And she was about to find out just how deep the shadows ran. The room felt colder than it had before, the air thick with an unspoken tension. Alexander's father, Charles Thorne, sat across from Elizabeth, his sharp gaze never leaving her face. She tried to steady her breathing, but the weight of his scrutiny was suffocating. "Tell me, Elizabeth," Charles began, his voice low and measured, "what is it that you truly see in my son?" Elizabeth blinked, taken aback by the question. She had expected pleasantries, maybe casual small talk, but not this. She had always believed her love for Alexander was enough. Enough to withstand the doubts of others, enough to prove that her feelings were genuine. But now, as she sat in front of this intimidating figure, she began to question everything. "I love him," she said firmly, though her voice faltered slightly. "I love Alexander for who he is, not his money, not his wealth. It's about who he is as a person. He's kind, he's caring, and he makes me feel like I matter." Charles leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him, as if considering her words carefully. That's a nice story, Elizabeth. But I think we both know that love is never as simple as it seems." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "Alexander, well, he's not exactly the man you think he is." Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. Her pulse quickened, and for the first time that night, a sense of dread crawled up her spine. She forced herself to remain composed, but the room suddenly felt much too small, the shadows too deep. "I don't understand," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "What do you mean?" Charles leaned forward, his eyes dark and filled with a calculating intensity. "Alexander has secrets, Elizabeth. Secrets that he's never told you. Secrets he's never told anyone." The words hung in the air, thick with implication. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to deny what he was saying, but something in his tone made her hesitate. Was this some sort of test? Was he trying to manipulate her, to scare her off? Or was there truth in his words? Before she could respond, Charles continued, his voice now tinged with something colder, more sinister. "He's not the loving man you think he is. I've watched him carefully over the years. He's always been driven by something darker, something he refuses to acknowledge, even to himself. He's made deals, Elizabeth, deals with people and organizations you wouldn't even begin to understand. And none of those deals come without consequences." Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face. She had heard the rumors, of course, the whispers of Alexander's mysterious past, his ruthless business dealings, and the shadows that seemed to follow him. But she had always brushed him aside, convinced that the man she loved was different, that he was nothing like the cold, calculating person people described. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She couldn't decide if she was angry or afraid. Maybe a bit of both. Charles's smile was thin, almost cruel. Because I want you to understand, Elizabeth. I want you to see that you've made a mistake. Alexander is dangerous. And if you continue down this path, you'll end up paying the price. Her mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the walls closing in, her senses on high alert. What was he trying to do? Was he trying to tear them apart? To make her doubt her love for Alexander? I don't believe you, Elizabeth said firmly. Standing up, you're just trying to control him, just like you always have. I don't care about your games. Alexander and I are getting married, and nothing you say will change that. Charles's expression darkened, his eyes cold and unreadable. You think you're in control, don't you? But you're not, Elizabeth. You're just another pawn in a game that's been played for far longer than you can imagine. Her stomach churned. What do you mean? She asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay calm. But before Charles could respond, a sudden sound interrupted their conversation. The door to the study creaked open, and Alexander appeared in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide with something Elizabeth couldn't quite place. He looked between her and his father, his jaw tightening. Dad, what are you doing? Alexander's voice was low, but there was a noticeable edge to it, a tension that hadn't been there before. Charles's gaze shifted to his son, his lips curling into a faint smile. I was just having a conversation with your fiancé, Alexander. She deserves to know the truth, after all. Alexander's eyes flicked to Elizabeth, his expression unreadable. She could see the conflict in his gaze, but there was something else there, something she couldn't understand. Was he angry, confused, or was it something more? Elizabeth, we need to talk, Alexander said, his voice strained. Please, come with me. She glanced at Charles, who was watching them both with a look of quiet satisfaction. Without a word, Elizabeth followed Alexander out of the study and down the hallway, her mind racing with questions. What was happening? Why was Alexander acting so distant, so different from the man she had fallen in love with? When they reached a private sitting room, Alexander closed the door behind them and turned to face her. His hands were clenched at his sides, his body rigid with tension. Elizabeth could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, and for the first time, she felt a deep, gnawing fear that maybe Charles had been right. Elizabeth, I need you to listen to me, Alexander said, his voice shaking slightly. There's something I've been keeping from you, something I never wanted you to find out. Elizabeth's heart stopped. What is it, Alexander? What's going on? He took a deep breath, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her pulse race. I'm not who you think I am. None of this, my wealth, my business, my family, none of it is what you believe it to be. I've been living a lie. And now I'm afraid it's too late. Her throat tightened, her mind reeling. What do you mean? I've been involved in things, Elizabeth, things I can't undo. People have been hurt because of me, because of the choices I made. And I can't protect you from it anymore. He stepped back, as if distancing himself from her, and for the first time since they met, Elizabeth saw the fear in his eyes. The fear wasn't just for himself, it was for her, too. And in that moment, Elizabeth realized that the love she had always believed in, the love she had fought so hard to protect, might be more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Elizabeth stood in front of Alexander, her heart racing as the words he had just spoken reverberated in her mind. The weight of his confession hung in the air between them like a storm cloud, dark and suffocating. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. Everything she had believed, everything she had trusted, was crumbling around her. What do you mean, Alexander? Her voice was shaky, barely a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a knife. What have you done? His gaze dropped to the floor, his fingers curling into fists at his sides, as if he were battling something inside himself. He shook his head slowly, his face drawn with anguish. I never wanted you to find out. I thought if I kept you away from my world, away from the truth, maybe you'd be safe. But now, everything's falling apart, and I don't know how to stop it. Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. She wanted to reach out to him, to comfort him, but the fear in his eyes, The desperation in his voice made her pull back. What was he hiding from her? What had he been involved in that was so dangerous? Alexander, please. Her voice cracked with emotion. I need to know. I need to understand. He lifted his gaze to meet hers. His eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and regret. It all started when I inherited my family's business. It was never just about running a corporation. My father, Charles, he's been involved in shady dealings for decades. I thought I could control it, that I could change things from the inside. But it's too big, too corrupt. I've made deals with people I shouldn't have. People who don't play by the same rules we do. And they've been watching us, Elizabeth, watching me. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. What kind of deals, Alexander? What have you gotten yourself into? He swallowed hard, the words seeming to stick in his throat, as if they were too painful to say. I thought I could outsmart them. I thought I could keep you away from it all. But I couldn't. There's no way out. And now they're threatening you. They want to hurt you to make sure I fall in line. Her mind spun. She felt like the ground was shifting beneath her feet, like the life she had known was slipping away. She couldn't wrap her head around it. The man she had married, this loving, generous person, was entangled in something far darker than she could have ever imagined. Who are these people? She demanded, her voice rising. Why didn't you tell me sooner? We could have figured it out together. I would have helped you. He stepped closer, grabbing her arms gently but urgently. His eyes were wild with fear, his breath shallow. You don't understand, Elizabeth. These people don't care about anything but power. They will destroy everything in their path to get what they want, and they've already started. They've been watching us for months. They know everything about us, about you, and now they've made it clear that if I don't cooperate, you'll pay the price. Elizabeth's heart pounded in her chest, panic rising in her throat. The walls of the mansion felt suffocating, closing in on her as the realization settled in. She was trapped. Trapped in a world she never asked for, surrounded by people she couldn't trust. Then we leave, she said, her voice trembling with fear, but laced with determination. We leave right now. We run away. We'll go somewhere safe, anywhere they can't find us. But Alexander shook his head, his face etched with regret. It's not that simple, Elizabeth. We can't just run. They'll find us. And when they do, they'll make sure we both pay. Elizabeth recoiled, the weight of his words sinking in. Then what do we do? How do we stop them? He paused, his eyes flickering with a mixture of guilt and resignation. There's no stopping them. They have too much control. My family, my father, they've made sure of that. The only thing we can do now is try to survive. And the only way to survive is to give them what they want. The crushing weight of his words hit Elizabeth like a punch to the gut. She had hoped, desperately hoped, that there would be some way out of this, some path forward that would involve losing everything. But now she understood. There was no escape. They were at the mercy of forces far greater than they could fight. The silence between them stretched on, thick with despair. Elizabeth's mind raced, her thoughts a blur of confusion and fear. She had married Alexander for love, for the hope of a future together. But now, that future seemed shattered, consumed by a dark reality she couldn't have foreseen. Suddenly, a noise interrupted the silence, a faint click from the hallway, followed by the soft shuffle of footsteps. Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat as she turned toward the door. A figure emerged from the shadows, and Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat when she saw who it was. Charles Thorne. He stood in the doorway, his presence as imposing as ever, a cruel smile curling at the corners of his lips. I see you finally had conversation, he said, his voice smooth and taunting. I trust my son has been honest with you. Elizabeth's stomach churned. She turned to Alexander, her mind racing as the truth began to settle in. This was all part of his plan, wasn't it? His father had orchestrated this, had manipulated them both into this twisted game. Alexander's face was unreadable. His shoulders slumped in defeat. You knew, didn't you? He said quietly, his voice breaking. You knew all along. Charles chuckled darkly, stepping further into the room. Of course I knew, my son. I've been the one pulling the strings this whole time. Everything you've done, every decision you've made, It's all been according to my plan. You were never in control. Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face. The man she had trusted, the man she had married, had been nothing but a pawn in his father's game. And now, she too was trapped in it. I don't believe this, she whispered, her voice thick with disbelief. All this time, everything was a lie? Charles's smile grew wider, more sinister. Not a lie, my dear. A carefully constructed reality. And now you're a part of it. You always have been. Elizabeth felt the walls closing in around her, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She had married for love, but what had she gotten herself into? A world of lies, betrayal, and manipulation. There was no escape now. No way out. Alexander stepped toward her, his face a mask of anguish. I'm so sorry, Elizabeth, he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. I never wanted this for you. I never wanted you to be a part of this world. But it was too late. The truth had been revealed, and the path forward was darker than she could have ever imagined. The price of love had come at a cost, and it was one Elizabeth would have to pay in ways she could never prepare for. The mansion felt colder now, as if the shadows themselves were closing in around Elizabeth. The weight of the truth, of everything she had learned, was too much to bear. The man she had married, the man she had trusted with her heart, had been a puppet in his father's cruel game, and she, unknowingly, had been dragged into it. Charles Thorne's presence in the room was like a suffocating cloud. His calm demeanor only made the situation more unnerving, as if he found amusement in the chaos he had caused. He looked at Elizabeth as though she were just another piece on his chessboard, a pawn he had moved with ease. Isn't it fascinating, Elizabeth? Charles said, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. How all of this was set into motion long before you even entered the picture. You think you've had a choice in all of this, but you never did. You were always meant to be here. Elizabeth's hands trembled, the reality of his words sinking in. She had been a part of their twisted world from the beginning, without ever realizing it. She had fallen in love with Alexander, convinced that their bond was real, that their love was pure. But it was all part of a larger plan, a plan that she had no say in. What do you want from me? She whispered, her voice barely audible. She didn't recognize the person she had become, the woman who had once believed in fairy tales, who had dreamed of a future with the man she loved. Now, those dreams seemed so distant, so unreachable. Charles took a step closer, his eyes gleaming with cold amusement. It's simple, really. I want you to understand your place. You are a part of this family now, whether you like it or not, and I will not allow you to disrupt everything we built. She looked at Alexander, who stood silently by the door, his face pale and worn. His eyes met hers, but there was no comfort there, only the haunting truth of his involvement in everything. Alexander, she said, her voice thick with emotion. How could you not tell me? All this time, all these lies. He closed his eyes, guilt written all over his face. I didn't want you to get hurt, Elizabeth. I didn't want you to know. I thought if I kept you away from all of this, maybe I could protect you. But now it's too late. Tears welled up in her eyes as the full weight of the situation crashed down on her. She had married him out of love, believing in their future together. But now, she saw the truth for what it was, a dark, twisted game, and she was a mere casualty in it. Is this really what you want, Alexander? She asked, her voice breaking. To be a part of this world? He hesitated, his eyes flickering with indecision. I don't have a choice anymore, Elizabeth. I've been trapped in this from the start. The things I've done, the deals I've made, they have consequences. Elizabeth's heart ached as she looked at him. She wanted to believe him, to trust that there was still a way out for them, but the truth was staring her in the face. Alexander's power, his wealth, his family, they had all been built on lies, manipulation, and greed, and she had been foolish enough to walk into it, to believe that love could save them. I never asked for any of this, Elizabeth whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. I never asked for any of it. Charles smirked, his eyes glinting with satisfaction. None of us do, my dear. But the reality is, we all play the hand we're dealt. And right now, you're in the middle of this game. You can either accept your place and live with it, or you can try to fight against it. But know this, there's no way out. The word struck Elizabeth like a slap in the face. No way out, no escape. She had spent so much of her life searching for a love that was real, something pure and untainted. And now, she was caught in the web of a dangerous game where the stakes were far higher than she could have ever imagined. But there was something else, something deeper inside her that refused to give up, something that still believed in the power of choice. The love she had felt for Alexander, the hope she had held on to for so long, couldn't simply be extinguished by a few dark revelations. She had always believed in the power of love to overcome anything, and maybe, just maybe, there was still a way to fight for it. "Tell me," Elizabeth said, her voice trembling but determined. "If I choose to walk away, what happens to me? What happens to Alexander?" Charles studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "If you walk away, you'll be nothing more than a memory, a forgotten pawn in a game you never should have played. As for Alexander, well, he's already made his choice. There's no turning back for him now." Her heart pounded in her chest, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She could walk away. She could leave everything behind and try to rebuild her life. But what about Alexander? Would she be leaving him to face the consequences alone? Elizabeth turned to Alexander, searching his eyes for some sign of hope, some indication that they could still find a way out of this together. But all she saw was fear, regret, and a deep, sorrowful acceptance of the reality he had created. "Alexander," she whispered, her voice raw, "I love you, but I can't keep living in this world. I can't be a part of this anymore." Tears welled in his eyes as he reached out to her, but she stepped back, shaking her head. "I need to find my own way, Alexander. I need to find myself again." For the first time, he seemed to understand. He nodded silently, his face etched with sadness. "I know. I understand. I'm sorry." Elizabeth turned away, her heart breaking with every step she took toward the door. As she left the room, she didn't look back. She couldn't. The weight of the decision had been made, and the life she had once dreamed was gone. But in that moment, Elizabeth realized that sometimes love wasn't enough to overcome the darkness. Sometimes the only way to survive was to walk away. And while the path ahead was uncertain, at least she was free. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and the mansion faded into the distance, leaving Elizabeth to face whatever future lay ahead, on her own. But for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a glimmer of hope, a sense of freedom. She wasn't a pawn anymore. She was her own person, and she would decide what came next. And as she walked away from the life she had known, she knew one thing for certain. She would never let anyone control her again.